Tier 1. Walt Disney. Walt Disney, the visionary behind one of entertainment's most enduring empires, leaves a legacy as complex as it is influential. While celebrated for his creative genius, Disney's alleged anti-Semitism has remained a controversial shadow across his reputation. Born in 1901 to a conservative Midwestern family, Disney's worldview was shaped by an era when casual prejudice was commonplace in American society. Several incidents fueled the perception of Disney's anti-Semitism. His 1938 hosting of German filmmaker Leni Riefenstahl, fresh from creating Nazi propaganda and shortly after Kristallnacht, raised eyebrows. His membership in the Motion Picture Alliance for the Preservation of American Ideals, an organization harboring members with anti-Semitic views, further complicated his image. Animator Art Babbitt, who became Disney's adversary during labor disputes, claimed Disney attended German-American Bund meetings. It was a little bit unsettling learning about this. It feels like a piece of my childhood just slipped away. Disney's early animations occasionally featured characters with stereotypical features associated with anti-Semitic caricatures, reflecting broader cultural prejudices of the time. Unlike many Hollywood studios founded and run by Jewish Americans, Disney's company notably lacked Jewish executives in leadership positions. Countervailing evidence suggests a more nuanced picture. Disney employed Jewish animators and collaborated with Jewish composers like Irving Berlin. No documented public anti-Semitic statements exist from Disney himself. Later in life, he made donations to Jewish charities and was named Man of the Year by Beverly Hills B'nai B'rith chapter in 1955. Disney's authorized biographer, Neil Gabler, himself Jewish and given unprecedented access to Disney's archives, concluded there was insufficient evidence to label Disney as anti-Semite in the conventional sense. Most historians view Disney as reflecting the casual prejudices of his generation rather than harboring extreme hatred. This tension between Disney's creative brilliance and personal shortcomings exemplifies how cultural icons often embody the contradictions of their times. Now, turning to someone else who stirred quite a bit of discussion. Mahatma Gandhi. Mahatma Gandhi is known worldwide as a champion of peace and freedom who helped India gain independence from British rule. His methods of non-violent resistance inspired movements across the globe. But there's another side to Gandhi that many people don't know about, especially his early years in South Africa, where he lived from 1893 to 1914. When Gandhi was a young lawyer in South Africa, he held views about Black Africans that would shock many of his admirers today. He often referred to Black South Americans using racist slurs and repeatedly argued that Indians were superior to Black people. In his writings from this period, Gandhi complained about Indians being classified with native Black Africans, who he described as uncivilized, troublesome, and dirty. During his time in Africa, Gandhi wasn't fighting for equal rights for all people. He was mainly concerned with the rights of Indians. He didn't challenge the overall system of racial hierarchy. He just wanted Indians to be placed higher up in that unfair system. When the Zulu uprising happened in 1906, Gandhi even volunteered to help the British Army against the Zulus, organizing a group of Indian stretcher bearers. Gandhi's racist views weren't just casual comments, they shaped his activism. He argued that Indians should have separate entrances from Black Africans at post offices and that Indians deserved voting rights while Black people didn't. As Gandhi got older, his views did evolve somewhat. By the time he returned to India, he was beginning to see connections between different struggles against oppression. Later in life, he became more supportive of universal human rights. Gandhi's complicated story reminds us that even celebrated heroes can have serious flaws. While his later work and philosophy of nonviolence deserve respect, we shouldn't ignore the racist beliefs he held for many years. Great figures from history were real people with contradictions, blind spots, and prejudices of their times. Let's shift our attention to another celebrated individual with a complex legacy, Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson is remembered as one of America's founding fathers, the main author of the Declaration of Independence and America's third president. His words about how all men are created equal have inspired people fighting for freedom around the world. But there's a huge contradiction at the heart of Jefferson's life that we can't ignore. While he wrote about liberty and human rights, he owned around 600 enslaved people during his lifetime. Jefferson wasn't just a slave owner. He was one of the largest slave owners in Virginia. He depended on enslaved labor to run his plantation at Monticello and to maintain his wealthy lifestyle. While he sometimes talked about slavery as an evil system, he freed very few people during his lifetime. Just 7 people, all from the Hemings family. Perhaps the most troubling part of Jefferson's story involves Sally Hemings, a woman he enslaved who was also the half-sister of his late wife. Historical evidence, including DNA testing in the 1990s, confirms that Jefferson fathered at least 6 children with Hemmings, beginning when she was a teenager and he was in his mid-40s. Their relationship cannot be considered consensual by modern standards because of the massive power imbalance between them. Jefferson wrote that he feared slavery would lead to a divine punishment for America, yet he continued to profit from it. He even calculated the financial returns from enslaved children, noting that they provided a good investment return. When he died deeply in debt, over 130 people he enslaved were sold at auction, separating many families. Jefferson's life shows how people can hold contradictory beliefs and how self-interest often wins out over principles. He created beautiful, powerful ideas about human freedom while directly denying that freedom to hundreds of people he owned. His complicated personality reminds us to look honestly at the people we look up to in our history. We can appreciate Jefferson's contributions to democracy while also acknowledging the profound moral failings that characterized his personal life and the painful hypocrisy at the foundation of America. While we're examining complex historical figures, we should also consider Mother Teresa. I know, I didn't expect to see this name either. Mother Teresa is known around the world as a symbol of kindness and charity. For decades, she was seen as a living saint who devoted her life to helping the poorest of the poor in Calcutta, India. When she won the Nobel Peace Prize in 1979, it seemed to confirm what many already believed, that she was one of the most selfless, caring people of our time. But behind the inspiring image, there's some unfortunate information about the care she actually provided. Many people who volunteered at Mother Teresa's missionaries of charity were shocked by what they saw. Her homes for the dying often lacked basic medical care, proper pain management, and even clean needles. Doctors who visited described seeing patients in pain being given aspirin when they needed much stronger medication. The facilities were often understaffed, with untrained volunteers trying to care for seriously ill people. What troubled many critics was that these problems weren't just about lack of money. Mother Teresa's organization received millions in donations, but very little went toward improving medical care. Instead, she seemed to believe that suffering brought people closer to God. She once told a patient, "You are suffering like Christ on the cross, so Jesus must be kissing you." Basic medical practices were often ignored. Needles were reused after being rinsed in tap water. People with different illnesses were placed together, allowing diseases to spread. Even patients who could have recovered with proper treatment didn't receive it, as the focus was more on spiritual care than medical help. While Mother Teresa traveled first class to meet world leaders and open new missions, conditions in her homes remained primitive. When she herself needed medical care, she went to high-quality hospitals in the United States, not her own facilities. Mother Teresa's story reminds us that good intentions aren't always enough. Someone can be sincere in their desire to help others, but still cause harm through outdated beliefs about suffering, or by prioritizing religious conversion over medical care. Now, for all you Apple users out there, let's take a quick look at what you're paying for. If you've made it this far, thank you. And let me know what you think about the people we've talked about so far in the comments below. Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs changed our world with sleek Apple products that transformed how we communicate, listen to music, and use technology. His genius for design and marketing made him a business legend and cultural icon. When he died in 2011, millions mourned as if they'd lost a personal friend. But behind the black turtleneck and inspiring speeches was a man whose personal behavior often crossed the line from demanding to downright cruel. Jobs was infamous for his management style at Apple. He would regularly humiliate employees in front of their colleagues, calling their work garbage and using much harsher words. He'd fire people in angry outbursts, sometimes during their first meeting. Even top executives weren't safe from his public takedowns. Many former employees describe walking through Apple's halls in fear, hoping to avoid Jobs' attention if he was in a bad mood. Perhaps the most troubling part of Jobs' personal story involves his first child, Lisa. When his girlfriend, Chris Ann Brennan, became pregnant in 1977, Jobs denied being the father, despite a paternity test showing he was. He swore in court documents that he couldn't have children, while simultaneously naming a new Apple computer Model D, Lisa. During this time, Brennan had to rely on welfare to support their daughter, even as Jobs was becoming a millionaire. Jobs initially refused to pay child support and had little contact with Lisa during her early years. It wasn't until she was older that he began to acknowledge her and develop a relationship, eventually admitting his earlier behavior was wrong. Even with close friends and business partners like Steve Wozniak, Jobs could be hurtful. He famously cheated Wozniak out of money in their early days and often took credit for others' ideas or work. Jobs' personal relationships show how someone can be brilliant in creating products people love while being deeply flawed in how they treat actual people. His story reminds us that success and innovation doesn't excuse cruelty, and that great achievements often come with a human cost we don't see in the polished keynote presentations. The genius who taught us to think different couldn't always apply that insight to how he treated those around him. Things are about to get even more interesting, so stick around. And if you're enjoying this, a like on the video really helps. Tier 2. John Lennon. John Lennon gave us beautiful songs about peace and love that still move people today. As a Beatle and solo artist, he created music that changed culture and inspired millions with lyrics like "Imagine all the people living life in peace" and "All you need is love." But the man who became a symbol of peace had a violent, troubled side that he himself eventually acknowledged. Lennon was open about his history of violence toward women in interviews later in his life. "I used to be cruel to my woman," he admitted, echoing his own lyrics from Getting Better. He confessed, "I was a hitter. I couldn't express myself, and I hit." His first wife, Cynthia, described in her memoir how Lennon once slapped her across the face when he saw her dancing with another man before they were married. His relationship with his oldest son, Julian, was also deeply problematic. After divorcing Cynthia when Julian was just 5 years old, Lennon largely abandoned his son. Julian later said his father was a hypocrite who could talk about peace and love but could never show it to his wife or son. During Julian's childhood, there were years where he barely saw his father at all. When they did spend time together, Lennon could be cruel and critical, once reportedly screaming at Julian for eating improperly at the dinner table. Even with Yoko Ono, the relationship was complex and sometimes toxic. Though they presented themselves as an ideal couple, Lennon admitted to being possessive and jealous. During his infamous Lost Weekend, an 18-month separation from Ono, Lennon's behavior while drinking became notoriously destructive. In the last few years of his life, Lennon seemed to be trying to change. He became a house husband, caring for his second son Sean and attempting to make peace with his past. He spoke about his open failings, which took courage, but his murder in 1980 cut short whatever personal growth he might have achieved. Lennon's story shows how someone can create art that inspires goodness while struggling with their own demons. The theme of celebrated public figures with more troubling private sides continues with Che Guevara. Che Guevara's face is everywhere, on t-shirts, posters, and dorm room walls around the world. With his beret, beard, and intense gaze, he's become the ultimate symbol of revolution and standing up to power. Millions who wear his image see him as a heroic fighter for the poor and oppressed, someone who gave up a comfortable life as a doctor to change the world. But behind the iconic photo lies a much more complicated and darker figure than many of his admirers realize. During the Cuban Revolution, Che served as Fidel Castro's right-hand man. After their victory in 1959, Guevara was put in charge of La Cabaña prison in Havana. There, he oversaw the execution of hundreds of people associated with the previous Batista regime. Many were killed without what most would consider fair trials, sometimes after hearings lasting just a few minutes, with Guevara personally signing the death orders. Even some who supported the revolution were disturbed by Che's ruthlessness. He wrote in his diary that he felt no compassion for enemies of the revolution and described the excitement he felt when ordering executions. He once declared, "To send men to the firing squad, judicial proof is unnecessary, and these procedures are an archaic bourgeois detail." When he helped set up Cuba's first labor camp for those who disagreed with the new government, Guevara announced, "We'll make them work until they drop." He had little patience for free speech or opposing views, helping create a system that silenced dissent and punished those who criticized the revolution. Later, when trying to spread revolution to Congo and Bolivia, Guevara showed frustration with local people who didn't embrace his vision, often describing them in his diaries with dismissive or racist language. Che's famous quote that, "The true revolutionary is guided by a great feeling of love," stands in stark contrast to the many lives he ended without hesitation. His story shows how idealism can turn to cruelty when people become convinced that the ends justify any means. The young medical student who wanted to heal the poor became a man who believed that violence was necessary to create a better world, leaving a legacy that's far more blood-soaked than the stylish image on t-shirts suggests. Another historical figure whose darker aspects often go unmentioned is Martin Luther. Martin Luther changed the course of Western history when he nailed his 95 Theses to a church door in 1517, challenging the Catholic Church and sparking the Protestant Reformation. He's celebrated for promoting the idea that ordinary people should be able to read the Bible in their own language and for standing up against powerful institutions with his famous words, "Here I stand, I can do no other." Luther helped reshape Christianity and gave birth to Protestant denominations that millions belong to today. But there's another side to Luther that many churches don't talk about much: his vicious writings against Jewish people, especially later in his life. Early on, Luther actually criticized Christians for mistreating Jews, thinking that Jews would convert to his purified version of Christianity. When that didn't happen, his attitude changed dramatically. In 1543, Luther published a book called On the Jews and Their Lies, which is shocking to read today. In it, he called Jewish people poisonous bitter worms and suggested terrible actions against them. He recommended burning their synagogues and schools, destroying their homes, taking away their religious books, forbidding rabbis to teach, and more. The language gets even worse as the book continues, with Luther using dehumanizing words that make for disturbing reading. Luther's anti-Semitic writings weren't just a footnote in his career. This book runs over 65,000 words, showing he put significant effort into these hateful ideas. 4 centuries later, the Nazis celebrated Luther's anti-Jewish views, reprinting his works during the Holocaust. At the Nuremberg trials, Julius Streicher, publisher of the anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, even defended himself by saying he hadn't said anything Martin Luther hadn't said first. Luther's story reminds us that people who make positive contributions to history can also promote terrible prejudices. His anti-Semitism wasn't just of his time. Many of his contemporaries were shocked by the extreme nature of his attacks on Jews. His legacy includes both religious freedom and hateful bigotry, a complicated mixture that challenges us to acknowledge both the good and deeply troubling aspects of influential historical figures, rather than creating simplified heroes or villains. From one field of achievement to another, we find comparable contradictions in Charles Lindbergh. Quick pause. If you're enjoying this video so far, give it a like. It really helps the channel out. Charles Lindbergh soared into history in 1927 when he became the first person to fly solo across the Atlantic Ocean. His 33-hour journey from New York to Paris in a small plane called the Spirit of St. Louis made him an instant American hero. Crowds of thousands cheered him in parades, and his handsome face appeared on magazine covers worldwide. He used his fame to help develop commercial aviation and promote air travel when many still feared flying. But behind his public image as a brave, all-American hero was a man with troubling views and connections to Nazi Germany. In the years before World War II, Lindbergh made several visits to Germany as an honored guest of high-ranking Nazi officials. He attended the 1936 Berlin Olympics as a special guest of Hermann Göring, one of Hitler's top leaders. Lindbergh openly admired what he saw in Nazi Germany, praising their powerful air force and the country's order and strength. In 1938, he accepted a medal from Hermann Göring, presented on Hitler's behalf, the Service Cross of the German Eagle with Star, and chose not to return it even after Nazi atrocities became widely known. When war broke out in Europe, Lindbergh became a leading voice against American involvement, speaking at America First rallies. In a notorious 1941 speech in Des Moines, Iowa, he blamed the British, the Jewish, and the Roosevelt administration for pushing America toward war. His anti-Semitic remarks shocked many Americans, as he claimed that Jewish people's greatest danger to this country lies in their large ownership and influence in our motion pictures, our press, our radio, and our government. Beyond his Nazi sympathies, Lindbergh was a strong supporter of eugenics, the idea that undesirable human traits should be eliminated through selective breeding. He wrote that we can prevent the defective from breeding and worried about the dilution of our European blood. After Pearl Harbor, Lindbergh did serve as a civilian consultant during the war and even flew combat missions in the Pacific, but his reputation was permanently damaged by his pre-war activities. Lindbergh's stories show how someone can achieve remarkable things while holding deeply troubling beliefs, a reminder that heroism in one area doesn't guarantee wisdom or moral charity in others. Another icon whose legacy deserves more nuanced examination is John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy still captivates Americans as the handsome, charismatic president whose life was cut tragically short in Dallas in 1963. He inspired a generation with his calls to public service, guided the nation through the Cuban Missile Crisis, and set America on path to the moon. His elegant speeches about civil rights and freedom continue to move people today. The Kennedy family became America's closest thing to royalty, and Camelot seemed the perfect nickname for JFK's brief shining presidency. But behind closed doors, Kennedy lived a double life that would shock many who admired him. Throughout his marriage to Jackie, he engaged in countless affairs that went beyond the occasional indiscretion. White House staffers were tasked with sneaking women into the presidential bedroom while his wife was away. These weren't just consensual relationships with adult women who understood the situation. Some involved serious abuse of power. One of Kennedy's most troubling relationships was with a 19-year-old White House intern named Mimi Alford, who later wrote about how the president pressured her into sexual acts during her very first tour of the White House. According to multiple accounts, JFK sometimes shared his girlfriends with his brother or male friends, treating women as objects to be passed around. The Secret Service had codenames for various mistresses, and Kennedy reportedly once told a friend, "I can't go to sleep unless I've had a lay." Journalists knew about his behavior but kept it quiet, a courtesy never extended to many other public figures, especially women. Beyond the personal betrayal of his wife, Kennedy's reckless sex life created serious national security risks during the Cold War. He allegedly had an affair with an East German woman who might have been a spy, and his relationship with Judith Campbell Exner connected him to mob boss Sam Giancana at the time when his brother Robert, as Attorney General, was supposedly fighting organized crime. Kennedy's story shows how power and charisma can shield someone from accountability. The media's willingness to look the other way allowed him to maintain an image of the perfect family man while behaving in ways that today would immediately end a political career. His policy accomplishments remain significant, but the complete picture of JFK is far more complicated than the heroic portrait many Americans still cherish. Now be sure to subscribe to my channel so I can keep you informed about similar subjects. It's about to get even more controversial out here. Wernher von Braun. Wernher von Braun is celebrated in America as the brilliant rocket scientist who helped NASA put the first humans on the moon. His genius made the massive Saturn V rocket possible, and he became a familiar face on television, explaining space travel to excited Americans during the 1960s. He even worked with Walt Disney on TV specials about the future of space exploration, becoming a respected public figure with a charming German accent and infectious enthusiasm for reaching the stars. But before he helped America achieve its greatest space triumph, von Braun had a very different employer, Adolf Hitler. As a young, ambitious engineer in Nazi Germany, von Braun eagerly joined both the Nazi Party and the SS, Hitler's elite guard. He led the team that developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range ballistic missile, which Hitler used to bomb London and other Allied cities during World War II, killing thousands of civilians. Even more disturbing was how these rockets were built. The V-2 production facility at Mittelwerk was an underground factory where over 20,000 concentration camp prisoners were forced to work in horrible conditions. Prisoners were starved, beaten, and worked to death, with bodies hanging from the factory ceilings as warnings to other workers. An estimated 12,000 slaves died building von Braun's rockets. More than were killed by the rockets themselves when they hit London. While von Braun later claimed he was unaware of the worst abuses, multiple witnesses placed him inside the underground factory where emaciated prisoners worked in plain sight. He admitted to visiting the nearby Buchenwald concentration camp to personally select prisoners with technical skills for his program. As the war ended, von Braun orchestrated his surrender to American forces, presenting himself as merely a scientist with no real Nazi connections. Through Operation Paperclip, the US government eagerly brought him and his team to America, whitewashing their Nazi past to gain their expertise in the growing Cold War with the Soviet Union. Von Braun's story forces us to question whether scientific genius excuses moral compromise. While his work helped humanity reach the moon, it came at a terrible price. The same hands that pointed toward the stars had earlier signed paperwork for slave labor, showing how technical brilliance doesn't guarantee ethical judgment. Henry Ford. Henry Ford transformed America and the world with his revolutionary approach to making cars. By introducing the moving assembly line, he made automobiles affordable for average people, not just the wealthy. His Model T changed how Americans lived, worked, and traveled. Ford paid his workers an unheard of $5 daily wage when other factory owners paid far less, and he employed immigrants and black workers when many businesses wouldn't. For these innovations, he's celebrated as an American business genius whose ideas helped create the middle class. But while Ford was changing transportation, he was also using his wealth and fame to spread hatred. In 1919, Ford bought a small Michigan newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, and turned it into a platform for vicious anti-Semitism. For 91 straight weeks, the paper published articles attacking Jewish people with headlines like "The Jewish Evil" and "The International Jew, the World's Problem." Ford required his car dealers across America to distribute the paper, giving these hateful ideas a massive audience. The articles claimed Jewish people were plotting to take over the world and blamed them for everything from wars to economic problems to jazz music. Ford collected these articles into a book called The International Jew, which was distributed widely in America and translated into 16 languages. When Adolf Hitler was building the Nazi movement in Germany, he kept a photo of Ford in his office and praised him in Mein Kampf, saying Ford was one great man who understood the Jewish threat. Ford's anti-Semitism wasn't just talk. He put it into action by refusing to do business with Jewish vendors and instructing his managers to avoid hiring Jewish employees. When criticized, Ford doubled down, financing research to prove his conspiracy theories. Only after years of boycotts against Ford Motor Company did he issue an apology in 1927, though many doubted its sincerity as he continued to accept honors from Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Ford shows how innovation and bigotry can exist in the same person. The man who helped create modern industrial America also used his platform to spread poisonous ideas that contributed to global anti-Semitism. His story reminds us that technological genius doesn't prevent moral blindness, and that we should evaluate historical figures in their full complexity rather than simple hero worship. Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan is remembered fondly by Americans as the warm, grandfatherly president who helped end the Cold War and restored national pride after difficult years of economic troubles and international embarrassments. His optimistic message about morning in America and his skill as the great communicator won him 2 landslide election victories. Even many who disagreed with his politics found him personally likable with his easy smile and well-timed jokes. But during Reagan's presidency, a deadly new disease began spreading rapidly, and his administration's response, or lack thereof, has become one of the most criticized aspects of his reign. When AIDS first appeared in 1981, it primarily affected gay men, a community Reagan showed little interest in supporting. Despite the growing death toll, Reagan didn't publicly mention AIDS until 1985, nearly 4 years into the epidemic when thousands had already died. During those crucial early years, Reagan's press secretary, Larry Speakes, treated questions about AIDS as jokes during White House briefings, making wisecracks and suggesting reporters might be gay if they were interested in the topic. This set a tone that the crisis wasn't to be taken seriously. Meanwhile, influential figures in Reagan's administration actively blocked efforts by public health officials to launch education campaigns or provide adequate funding for research. By the time Reagan finally delivered a major speech about AIDS in 1987, near the end of his presidency, around 20,000 Americans had died, and the disease was spreading rapidly beyond initial risk groups. Even then, his administration emphasized abstinence rather than comprehensive prevention education. People living with HIV, AIDS, and their advocates had to fight desperately for attention and resources. Groups like ACT UP formed to protest government inaction with dramatic demonstrations. Many believe that if Reagan had used his considerable communication skills and political capital to address AIDS earlier, thousands of lives might have been saved. Reagan's silence and inaction during the early AIDS crisis reflected a broader indifference to LGBTQ Americans in his administration. While he built a reputation as a compassionate leader who cared deeply about American lives, that compassion had clear limits. For many in the communities devastated by AIDS, Reagan's impact was just years of darkness when their suffering was deemed unworthy of presidential attention or urgent action. Up next, a figure that you wouldn't have expected to make this list in a million years, especially as a Christian: Pope John Paul II. It feels a bit unsettling to challenge the idealized image of the Pope, but the truth matters, and it's important to put the facts on the record. Pope John Paul II was one of the most beloved and influential popes in modern history. During his 27-year papacy from 1978 to 2005, he helped bring down communism in his native Poland, traveled to more countries than any previous pope, and built bridges with other religions. His charisma and personal warmth made him popular even with many non-Catholics. After surviving an assassination attempt, he famously forgave his would-be killer, showing the compassion and forgiveness he preached. The Vatican fast-tracked his path to sainthood, declaring him a saint in 2014, just 9 years after his death. But beneath this inspiring public image lies a troubling truth regarding the Catholic Church's sexual abuse crisis. During John Paul II's leadership, evidence mounted of widespread abuse of children by priests across many countries. Instead of confronting this crisis head-on, his Vatican repeatedly chose to protect the institution over vulnerable children. One of the most damaging decisions was the Pope's support of Father Martial Marcial, the founder of the Legion of Christ. Despite receiving credible abuse allegations against Martial as early as 1998, John Paul continued to praise him as an efficacious guide to youth. It was only after John Paul's death that the Vatican finally acknowledged Martial had sexually abused seminarians and fathered several children. In the United States, Ireland, Australia, and elsewhere, the pattern was similar. Bishops who covered up abuse were protected, while victims were often ignored, silenced, or forced to sign confidentiality agreements. When Cardinal Bernard Law resigned from Boston after his role in shuffling abusive priests between parishes was exposed, John Paul gave him a prestigious position in Rome, a move many saw as a reward rather than accountability. A 2023 independent report in Poland revealed that John Paul knew about abuse cases even before becoming pope and still promoted accused priests. Documents showed he received multiple warnings about Theodore McCarrick's misconduct for years before McCarrick was made a cardinal. John Paul's failure on abuse has complicated his legacy for many Catholics. His defenders argue that he was misled by advisors or that his experience with false accusations against clergy under communist rule made him skeptical of claims. Yet for abuse survivors, these explanations ring hollow. The Pope, who showed moral courage standing against political oppression, failed to use that same courage to protect children within his own church, leaving a painful contradiction in the story of a man otherwise admired for his compassion and moral leadership. Learning about a pope being connected to something so troubling can be difficult to process. Let me know what you think about this in the comments. Another widely respected figure whose full story often goes untold is Albert Einstein. We all know Albert Einstein revolutionized our understanding of the universe with his theory of relativity. His wild hair, playful smile, and famous equation E=mc² have made him the ultimate symbol of genius. Einstein used his fame to advocate for peace, speak against racism, and support the creation of Israel. His quotes about imagination, curiosity, and the world of science inspire people worldwide. Even those who don't understand physics recognize Einstein as one of humanity's greatest minds. But while Einstein was developing his groundbreaking theories, his personal life revealed a much less admirable character. His relationship with his first wife, Mileva Maric, shows a man whose treatment of women fell far short of his intellectual achievements. Maric was a talented physicist herself, one of the first women to study physics at the prestigious Swiss Federal Polytechnic. Yet as their relationship progressed, Einstein gradually crushed her scientific ambitions. Letters discovered in the 1980s revealed the disturbing dynamic of their marriage. In 1914, Einstein gave Maric a list of demands she had to accept if they were to continue living together. These included, "You will make sure that my clothes and laundry are kept in good order, that I will receive my 3 meals regularly in my room, that my bedroom and study are always kept neat, and especially that my desk is left for my use only." Another rule stated, "You will renounce all personal relations with me insofar as they are not completely necessary for social reasons. You will stop talking to me if I request it." Essentially, Einstein wanted a servant, not a partner. He told Maric she should not expect intimacy nor to be spoken to about his work. When they eventually divorced, Einstein promised Maric the money from his eventual Nobel Prize as part of the settlement. When he received it in 1921, he gave most of it to his sons and very little to Maric, despite her financial struggles. There's also evidence suggesting Maric may have contributed mathematically to Einstein's early work, though historians debate the extent of her involvement. What's clear is that Einstein carried on multiple affairs during their marriage, including with his cousin Elsa, who became his second wife. Einstein's personal failings don't erase his scientific brilliance or later humanitarian work, but they remind us that great minds don't always show greatness in their personal relationships. The man who understood the cosmos so deeply often failed to understand the pain he caused to those closest to him. Another supposedly exemplary figure with a more complicated reality was Richard Branson. Richard Branson has built an image as the cool, fun billionaire who does business differently. With his long hair, big smile, and adventure-seeking lifestyle, he seems more like a rock star than a typical CEO. His Virgin brand spans airlines, trains, mobile phones, gyms, and even space tourism. Branson's personal brand emphasizes treating employees well, having fun at work, and challenging stuffy corporate culture. His books and speeches present him as a caring boss who puts people before profits, and many see him as a model of ethical capitalism. But behind this carefully crafted image, former employees and labor advocates tell a different story about how the Virgin Group actually treats its workers. While Branson jets between his private island and attempts record-breaking adventures, many Virgin employees have struggled with low wages and tough working conditions. Former Virgin Atlantic flight attendants have described being underpaid compared to other airlines while expected to maintain the company's premium image. When Virgin workers have tried to organize for better conditions, they've often met resistance. In 2018, Virgin Atlantic pilots voted to strike over pay and benefits, with union representatives claiming the company wasn't respecting their collective bargaining rights. Similar conflicts have emerged at Virgin Trains and other parts of the Virgin Empire, with labor groups accusing the company of anti-union tactics despite Branson's progressive public image. Virgin Care, Branson's healthcare division, raised eyebrows by suing Britain's National Health Service after losing a contract bid, taking money from the public healthcare system during a funding crisis. Meanwhile, during COVID-19, Branson asked for government bailouts for Virgin Atlantic while residing in his tax-free private island home in the British Virgin Isles, a move many criticized as hypocritical. Former employees have noted the disconnect between Branson's public persona and workplace realities, with one telling a British newspaper, "He sells this dream that working for him is amazing, but the pay doesn't match the expectations." Others have described high turnover rates and a culture where maintaining the brand's hip image comes before worker well-being. Like many billionaire founders, Branson has benefited from telling an inspiring story about himself and his companies, one where making money and doing good go hand in hand. However, for many who've worked within his companies, the experience has been more complex, raising questions about whether the reality aligns with the bearded billionaire's promises of a better way to do business. And now, continuing with leaders whose actions had serious consequences for those who relied on them, let's turn to another president, Franklin D. Roosevelt. Franklin D. Roosevelt is remembered as one of America's greatest presidents. He guided the nation through the Great Depression with his New Deal programs and led the country to victory during most of World War II. Roosevelt's fireside chats brought comfort to millions of Americans during dark times, and his leadership helped establish Social Security, unemployment insurance, and many other programs that created a social safety net. Despite being paralyzed from polio, he projected strength and optimism when the country needed it most. Then in February 1942, Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9066, a decision that stands as one of the darkest chapters in American civil liberties. This order authorized the forced removal and incarceration of nearly 120,000 Japanese Americans, most of whom were U.S. citizens. Entire families were given just days to sell their homes, businesses, and belongings before being sent to hastily built camps surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards in remote, harsh locations across the American West. The justification was military necessity after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor, but no evidence ever emerged of Japanese-American disloyalty or espionage. German Americans and Italian Americans faced no similar mass incarceration, revealing the racial basis of the policy. Military leaders like General John DeWitt promoted the internment with openly racist statements, claiming that a Jap's a Jap, regardless of citizenship. These Americans lost nearly everything: homes, businesses, farms, and personal possessions worth billions in today's dollars. They lived in cramped barracks with minimal privacy, enduring extreme desert heat and winter cold. Despite these conditions, many young Japanese American men volunteered from the camps to serve in the U.S. military, forming the highly decorated 442nd Regimental Combat Team that became the most decorated unit of its size in American history. Roosevelt's decision came despite reports from his own intelligence agencies finding that Japanese Americans posed no security threat. His attorney general opposed the order, but Roosevelt sided with military officials and West Coast politicians responding to public hysteria and long-standing anti-Asian sentiment. While some of his work clearly had a positive impact, it's difficult to view it the same way in light of what's now known. It took more than 40 years for the US government to apologize and provide modest reparations to survivors of camps. The Supreme Court's decision upholding the internment, Korematsu versus United States, remains one of the court's most criticized rulings, though it has never been formally overturned. Roosevelt's impact includes both extraordinary leadership during the crisis and this profound failure to protect the constitutional rights of Americans based solely on their ancestry, a reminder that even celebrated leaders can make decisions that betray their nation's highest ideals. Before we dive into the next part, a quick reminder to turn on notifications so you catch new uploads right away. Some of you might already know this next story, but for many, it may come as a complete shock. Oprah Winfrey. Oprah Winfrey's rise from poverty to become one of the world's most influential women is a truly inspiring American story. Growing up in poor Mississippi, facing abuse in her childhood, she overcame tremendous obstacles to build a media empire worth billions. Her talk show ran for 25 years, tackling important social issues and connecting with audiences in a uniquely personal way. Through her book club, philanthropic work, and advocacy, she's empowered millions, particularly women, to improve their lives. Oprah's ability to make people feel heard and understood has given her a level of trust few public figures achieve. But this deep trust has sometimes led Oprah to elevate and promote individuals who were later revealed to be serial predators. For years, Oprah maintained a close relationship with Hollywood producer Harvey Weinstein, appearing at his events and allowing him on her show. Photos show them embracing at parties and premieres, even as rumors circulated in Hollywood about Weinstein's predatory behavior toward women. Oprah continued their public friendship. When the Me Too movement finally exposed Weinstein's decades of sexual assault and harassment in 2017, which eventually led to his conviction and a 23-year prison sentence, many questioned how someone with Oprah's influence could have been so close to him without being aware. Perhaps most troubling was Oprah's enthusiastic promotion of João Teixeira de Faria, known as John of God, a Brazilian spiritual healer she featured on her show in 2010 and again in 2012. After Oprah's endorsement, thousands of people, many of them vulnerable and ill, flocked to his healing center. In 2018, more than 300 women came forward with accusations that he had sexually abused them during healing sessions. He was eventually sentenced to 19 years in prison for rape and sexual assault. While Oprah condemned both men after their crimes became public, critics have questioned why she used her massive platform to elevate them in the first place. Some former employees have suggested that in the competitive world of television, booking interesting guests sometimes took priority over thorough vetting. This highlights why it's important to view people with nuance. Everyone has their complexities, some more challenging than others. Oprah's story is a reminder of that. Oprah's connections to these predators don't erase the good she's done or suggest she knew about their crimes, but they do reveal the complicated responsibility that comes with her level of influence and trust. When Oprah presents someone as worthy of admiration, millions listen. Her story reminds us that even the most inspiring figures can make significant misjudgments that have real consequences for vulnerable people. Switching things up a bit, I started digging into the story of a famous psychoanalyst, Sigmund Freud. Sigmund Freud is known worldwide as the father of psychoanalysis, the man who revolutionized how we think about the human mind. His theories about the unconscious mind, defense mechanisms, and childhood development have influenced everything from psychology and medicine to art, literature, and everyday conversation. Terms he popularized like Freudian slip, ego, and denial are now part of our everyday language. Freud created the idea of talk therapy, the notion that speaking about our problems could help heal psychological wounds, an approach that has helped millions. But behind Freud's groundbreaking work were some seriously questionable beliefs and practices. For several years in the 1880s, Freud was an enthusiastic promoter of cocaine, which was legal at the time but poorly understood. He wrote scientific papers praising it as a wonderful drug, calling it a cure for depression, digestive problems, asthma, and even morphine addiction. Freud used cocaine regularly himself and prescribed it to friends, family, and patients, including his friend Ernst von Fleischl-Marxow, who developed a painful cocaine addiction as a result. It just goes to show, whenever people talk about the great men of history, there's usually a lot more to the story than meets the eye. Even more troubling was Freud's approach to women's psychological suffering. When women came to him describing what we now recognize as symptoms of sexual abuse or trauma, Freud initially believed their accounts, but he later reversed course, deciding these stories were actually fantasies based on the women's own desires. This seduction theory reversal had enormous consequences as it shifted blame onto the victims themselves. Freud's theories often portrayed women as inherently less developed than men. He famously described women as suffering from penis envy and suggested that women's moral development was weaker than men's. When female colleagues like Karen Horney challenged these sexist theories, Freud and his male followers often dismissed or marginalized their work. Many of Freud's most famous cases show troubling misogyny. When treating Dora, a young woman who had been sexually harassed by her father's friend, Freud interpreted her resistance to the man's advances as repressed desire rather than legitimate self-protection. He labeled her hysterical when she eventually quit therapy. While Freud deserves credit for creating a new way to understand human psychology, his cocaine advocacy and deeply sexist views caused real harm. Much of modern psychology has moved beyond Freud's specific theories while keeping his broader insights about the importance of childhood experiences and unconscious motivations. His true story shows how scientific pioneers can make important discoveries while simultaneously promoting harmful ideas that reflect their own biases and the prejudices of their time. Now for an iconic celebrity with shady dealings. Bono. Bono has spent decades as not just the leader of one of the world's biggest rock bands, U2, but also as a global humanitarian icon. With his ever-present sunglasses and passionate speeches, he's met presidents and prime ministers to advocate for debt relief, AIDS treatments, and poverty reduction in Africa. His One campaign and Red Initiative have raised awareness and millions of dollars for important causes. Time magazine named him Person of the Year alongside Bill and Melinda Gates for his humanitarian work, and he's received numerous honors including a knighthood from Queen Elizabeth II. But behind Bono's public image as a champion for the world's poor lies a more complicated reality. While calling on governments to increase aid to developing countries, Bono and U2 moved parts of their business from Ireland to the Netherlands in 2006 to take advantage of lower tax rates. This came after Ireland changed its tax laws on royalty income. The move allowed them to legally avoid paying millions in taxes to their home country, the same taxes that fund the government services and international aid that Bono publicly advocates for. When confronted about this contradiction, Bono defended the practice, saying, "It's just some smart people we have working for us trying to be sensible about the way we're taxed." This response struck many as tone deaf, coming from someone who regularly lectures world leaders about their moral obligations to the poor. Critics have also pointed to the performative nature of some of Bono's activism. African intellectuals like Dambisa Moyo have criticized Bono's approach as promoting a simplistic, savior-like narrative about Africa that ignores local voices and solutions. Former African Development Bank President James Shikwati once remarked, "Bono's whole bit about aid for Africa is just the latest in the West's white man's burden mentality." Even Bono's charity work has faced scrutiny. A 2010 report revealed that his One campaign, despite raising millions, gave just 1.2% of its funds to actual charitable causes, with the rest going to salaries and publicity. Bono's response was that One is an advocacy organization, not a traditional charity, a technical distinction lost on many who assumed their donations were directly helping the poor. I don't think his accomplishments should be dismissed, but it's hard to see his work the same way after learning more. Bono's contradictions reflect a broader issue with celebrity philanthropy, where public gestures often receive more attention than substantive action. While his advocacy has undoubtedly raised awareness for important causes, the gap between his passionate rhetoric about justice and his personal financial choices shows how difficult it can be to fully live up to the values you preach on the global stage. If you're still here, don't forget to subscribe. It really helps me keep making these videos for you. Tier 4. Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill stands tall in history as the cigar-chomping, bulldog-spirited leader who guided Britain through its darkest hour during World War II. His defiant speeches rallied a nation facing Nazi invasion, and his determination helped secure Allied victory. For many, especially in Britain and America, Churchill represents courage, freedom, and democracy triumphant against fascism. His witty quotes fill inspirational books, and his impact as a war hero seems unshakable. But across the Indian subcontinent, many see Churchill through a very different lens, as a leader whose racist views and wartime decisions contributed to one of the deadliest famines in history. In 1943, while Churchill was Prime Minister, the Bengal region of British-controlled India experienced a devastating famine that killed an estimated 3 million people. Food supplies were already strained, but Churchill's wartime cabinet made decisions that dramatically worsened the crisis. When asked to send emergency food supplies to India, Churchill repeatedly refused, despite having access to grain stockpiles in Australia and warnings from British officials in India about the severity of the situation. Ships that could have delivered food were used for other military priorities, even though the region was not an active war zone. Churchill even ordered the export of rice from coastal Bengal to build up food reserves elsewhere in the empire. When officials bravely brought news of the starving people to Churchill, he reportedly asked why Gandhi hadn't died yet if the famine was so bad. In a particularly revealing moment, Churchill blamed the Indians themselves, claiming they breed like rabbits and were causing their own misery, clear evidence of his racist attitudes toward the people under British colonial rule. Churchill's defenders argue that wartime necessities required tough decisions and that local corruption and hoarding worsened the situation. But Churchill's documented contempt for Indians reveal how racism influenced his priorities. He once declared, "I hate Indians. They are a beastly people with a beastly religion." For millions of people in South Asia, Churchill's refusal to help during the Bengal famine overshadows his fight against Nazi Germany. While the West celebrates him for saving European democracy, many Indians see him as a leader who considered Indian lives expendable. This stark contrast shows how historical figures can be heroes in one context while causing tremendous suffering in another. A reminder that greatness often depends on who is telling the story and who was harmed along the way. But speaking of widely admired figures with complicated legacies, here's a name many once saw as almost flawless: Helen Keller. Helen Keller's story has inspired generations of schoolchildren around the world. Becoming deaf and blind at just 19 months old, she overcame seemingly impossible obstacles to learn to communicate, graduate from college, and become an acclaimed author and activist. With the help of her dedicated teacher, Anne Sullivan, Keller's journey from isolation to intellectual achievement symbolizes human potential and perseverance. Her autobiography, The Story of My Life, and the play and film, The Miracle Worker, have made her an enduring symbol of hope and determination. But the inspiring story most of us learn about Helen Keller ends too early, leaving out her adult life as a radical activist with some deeply troubling views. While Keller fought passionately for disability rights, women's suffrage, and worker rights, she also supported eugenics, the now discredited movement that promoted selective breeding of humans to improve genetic qualities and prevent undesirable traits from being passed down. It makes you think, maybe the version we've mostly heard in the news didn't tell the whole story. In a 1915 article titled "Physicians' Juries for Defective Babies," Keller explicitly defended the rights of doctors to let severely disabled infants die, writing, "Our puny sentimentalism has caused us to forget that a human life is sacred only when it may be of some use to itself and to the world." This position is particularly shocking coming from someone who, had she been born later, might herself have been considered a candidate for such treatment. Keller also supported the forced sterilization of people with certain disabilities and mental illnesses. In a letter to prominent eugenicist Charles Davenport, she wrote about the need to address the terrible increase in the number of defectives, delinquents, and dependents. She worried that charitable institutions were allowing the deaf and blind to offset their affliction by marrying and having children who might inherit their conditions. These views reflected mainstream scientific thinking of her era, when eugenics was endorsed by many progressives who saw it as a rational way to improve society. Leading universities taught eugenics, and many states passed forced sterilization laws targeting the disabled, mentally ill, poor, and certain racial groups. By the 1930s, the Nazi regime would take these ideas to horrific extremes, eventually leading to the discrediting of the entire eugenics movement. Keller's support for eugenics doesn't erase her remarkable achievements or advocacy for many important causes, but it does reveal how even someone who personally experienced discrimination based on disability could still embrace theories that devalued the lives of other disabled people. Her complex history reminds us that our heroes are often products of their time, capable of both groundbreaking compassion and troubling blind spots. From one continent to another, this theme of flawed greatness comes up again and again in different forms. Leopold II of Belgium. King Leopold II of Belgium presented himself to the world as a philanthropist bringing civilization, Christianity, and commerce to Africa. In the late 1800s, European powers were carving up the African continent, and Leopold managed to convince other nations that his interest in the Congo was purely humanitarian. He established charities and organizations with noble-sounding names like the International Association for the Exploration and Civilization of the Congo. European countries and the United States eventually recognized his claim to this massive territory in Central Africa, which became known as the Congo Free State, though it wasn't a state at all, but Leopold's personal property, roughly 76 times larger than Belgium itself. What followed was one of history's most brutal colonial regimes, hidden for years behind Leopold's careful public relations. Unlike other colonial powers that at least nominally answered to their governments, the Congo was Leopold's private business venture. When rubber became valuable for the growing automobile industry, Leopold's agents forced the Congolese people to collect wild rubber from the rainforest. Those who failed to meet impossible quotas faced horrific punishments. Leopold's force publique soldiers took women and children hostage, flogged people to death, and most notoriously, cut off the hands of those who failed to deliver enough rubber, including children. These severed hands were presented to officers as proof that punishment had been carried out. Villages that resisted were burned to the ground. Families were deliberately broken apart, and starvation was widespread as people couldn't grow food while laboring to collect rubber. The death toll was staggering. An estimated 10 million Congolese people, roughly half the population, died under Leopold's rule from 1885 to 1908. This wasn't merely harsh colonialism. It was a deliberate system of murder, torture, and terror designed to extract maximum profit with minimum investment. The truth eventually came light thanks to missionaries, Journalists like E.D. Morel and activists including African-American writer George Washington Williams, who documented the atrocities. Famous writer Mark Twain and Irish diplomat Roger Casement joined the campaign against Leopold's brutality. Facing international pressure, Belgium finally took the Congo from Leopold in 1908, ending his personal rule but continuing colonial control. I try to imagine what things were like back then, but some actions just feel wrong no matter the time period. Despite orchestrating one of history's largest genocides, Leopold never visited the Congo himself. He used the enormous profits from rubber and ivory to build grand palaces and monuments in Belgium, many of which still stand today. Until recently, Belgian schoolchildren learned almost nothing about these atrocities, and Leopold was portrayed as a visionary king who expanded Belgian influence. This should tell us how easily humanitarian language can mask the worst of human cruelty, and how the lives of millions of Africans were considered worthless in the pursuit of European wealth. Unfortunately, it just keeps getting darker from this point. Grover Cleveland. Grover Cleveland holds a unique place in American history as the only president to serve two non-consecutive terms, 1885 to 1889 and 1893 to 1897. Historians praise him for his honesty, opposition to political corruption, and commitment to fiscal responsibility. His supporters celebrated him as Grover the Good, a man of strong moral character who stood against the political patronage system of his era. Cleveland's face appeared on the $1,000 bill, and his reputation as a principled leader persisted for generations. Yet behind this carefully constructed image lies a deeply troubling personal history that raises serious questions about Cleveland's character and treatment of women. In 1873, while serving as sheriff of Erie County, New York, Cleveland met Maria Halpin, a 38-year-old widow. According to Halpin's account, Cleveland sexually assaulted her after they had dinner together. She became pregnant as a result of this encounter. After Halpin gave birth to a son, Cleveland arranged to have the child taken from her and placed in an orphanage. More disturbing still, he used his influence to have Halpin committed to a mental asylum. She was only released after an evaluation determined she was not mentally ill but was suffering from alcoholism. Cleveland admitted to financially supporting the child but denied paternity, suggesting Halpin had been involved with other men, though he never provided evidence for these claims. When Cleveland ran for president in 1884, this scandal emerged during the campaign. His political team worked to discredit Halpin, portraying her as promiscuous and unstable while casting Cleveland as the honorable man who had taken responsibility for a child who might not have been his. His campaign strategy of admitting to the child while attacking the mother's character proved effective, as Cleveland narrowly won the election. The treatment of Halpin reflects the profound gender inequalities of the era, where a powerful man could effectively silence a woman's account of sexual assault and separate her from her child with little consequence. While some historians have attempted to downplay these events as private matters or products of their time, they represent a serious abuse of power that caused lasting harm to both Halpin and her son. Cleveland's presidency may have included notable achievements, but a complete accounting of his legacy must acknowledge this troubling history of alleged sexual assault and the subsequent use of institutional power to punish his accuser, actions that stand in stark contrast to the public image of moral rectitude that defined his political career. Speaking of historical icons with problematic aspects, this next well-known saint had a side that might surprise you. Albert Schweitzer. Albert Schweitzer seemed like a real-life saint to many people during his time. A brilliant man who excelled as a theologian, philosopher, organist, and biblical scholar, he gave up a comfortable European career to become a doctor and serve in Africa. In 1913, he established a hospital in Lambaréné, Gabon, where he worked for over 4 decades treating thousands of patients with diseases like malaria, leprosy, and sleeping sickness. His philosophy of reverence for life earned him the Nobel Peace Prize in 1952, and he became an international symbol of selfless humanitarian service and compassion. But behind Schweitzer's seemingly noble mission lay deeply problematic attitudes towards the very people he dedicated his life to helping. Despite living in Africa for nearly 50 years, he never learned local languages, relying instead on interpreters. More troubling were his written views about Africans, whom he described as his younger brothers and sisters, not equals, but childlike people requiring guidance from supposedly superior Europeans. In his books and letters, Schweitzer repeatedly expressed beliefs in white racial superiority. "The African is indeed my brother," he wrote, "but my junior brother." He described black Africans as having the thinking of a child and believed they weren't ready for self-governance or modern society. Even as independence movements were growing across Africa, Schweitzer maintained his colonial mindset, opposing African self-rule and suggesting that Europeans needed to maintain control for the Africans' own good. The hospital Schweitzer ran reflected these attitudes. While providing needed medical care, it was deliberately primitive by the standards of the time, lacking modern amenities that existed in other colonial hospitals. Schweitzer insisted on simple structures that matched what he considered appropriate for Africans. He rarely trained local people as medical professionals, preferring to import European staff and keeping Africans in subordinate roles. Visitors to Lambaréné often noted the strange dynamic. Patients and their families would bring food, build their own shelters, and were expected to show immense gratitude while Schweitzer maintained strict control. Many felt the hospital was designed to reinforce colonial hierarchies rather than empower local communities. Schweitzer's genuine commitment to help others existed alongside a deeply ingrained sense of white superiority. His story reminds us that humanitarian work, even when saving lives, can still perpetuate harmful power dynamics when it's built on a foundation of racial prejudice rather than true equality. The Nobel Prize winner who wrote eloquently about respecting all life never fully extended that same respect to the African people he chose to live among. Now, for a name you didn't think was even capable of being a bad person, Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking captured the world's imagination as the brilliant physicist who explored the deepest mysteries of the universe while battling ALS for over 50 years. His book, A Brief History of Time, sold more than 10 million copies, making complex ideas about black holes and the origins of the cosmos accessible to everyday readers. Despite being almost completely paralyzed and speaking through a computer, Hawking became a global celebrity, appearing on TV shows like The Simpsons and The Big Bang Theory. His triumph over physical limitations while making groundbreaking scientific discoveries made him seem almost superhuman. But behind this inspiring public image were troubling allegations about Hawking's treatment of those closest to him, particularly his first wife, Jane Wilde. The couple met before Hawking's diagnosis, and Jane stayed with him for 30 years as his condition worsened, raising their 3 children while supporting his career. In her memoir, Jane described how the marriage became increasingly difficult not just because of Hawking's illness, but because of his behavior toward her. According to Jane, Hawking could be emotionally cruel, dismissive of her needs, and verbally abusive. As his fame grew, she felt increasingly pushed aside. Their son Robert has spoken about witnessing his father's harsh treatment of his mother, saying Hawking could be enormously stubborn and unnecessarily hard on Jane. Lucy, their daughter, has also acknowledged the strain her father's behavior placed on the family. The situation reportedly worsened when nurses became more involved in Hawking's care. Some nurses who worked with Hawking filed reports alleging they witnessed him acting abusively toward Jane. Several quit over what they described as a toxic household environment. In 1990, Hawking left Jane for one of his nurses, Elaine Mason, whom he later married. Concerning allegations continued during Hawking's second marriage. Police investigated multiple reports from other nurses and Hawking's children that Mason was physically abusing him, though Hawking denied these claims and no charges were filed. The marriage ended in divorce after 11 years. Hawking's personal life reveals the complicated reality that brilliant minds don't necessarily translate to emotional intelligence or kind behavior in intimate relationships. While his scientific contributions and perseverance against physical odds remain remarkable, the accounts from family members and caregivers suggest that the celebrated physicist could be harsh and hurtful to those who sacrificed much to support him. Like many geniuses throughout history, Hawking's extraordinary gifts in one area coexisted with troubling shortcomings in how he treated the people who loved him most. Now for the shocking truth about yet another president with a very nasty habit. George H.W. Bush. George H.W. Bush served as America's 41st president after decades of public service as congressman, CIA director, ambassador, and vice president. Many respected him for his foreign policy experience, his calm handling of the end of the Cold War, and his leadership during the Gulf War. After leaving office, he built a reputation as a dignified elder statesman who worked across party lines on humanitarian causes with former rival Bill Clinton. When he died in 2018 at age 94, tributes poured in from around the world, praising his decency, humility, and lifetime of service to his country. But in the final years of Bush's life, a different side of his personality emerged when multiple women came forward with allegations that he had touched them inappropriately. Beginning in 2017, at least 8 women publicly accused the former president of groping them during photo opportunities. The first accusation came from actress Heather Lind, who said Bush had touched her buttocks while they were posing for a picture at a promotional event in 2014. She also said he told her a dirty joke. After Lind's accusation, other women came forward with similar stories. Actress Jordana Grolnick described Bush touching her rear end during a theater photo op. Author Christina Baker Klein, journalist Liz Allen, and several other women reported nearly identical experiences. Bush allegedly grabbing their buttocks while taking photos, often while telling a dirty joke as a distraction. The accusations spanned from 1992 to 2016 and came from women ranging from teenagers to seniors. Bush's spokesman initially responded to these allegations with a statement that, as an elderly man in a wheelchair, the former president's arms fell at the waists of those with whom he took pictures, and he patted women's rears in what he intended to be a good-natured manner. The statement also said that due to his Parkinson's disease, Bush's arms sometimes fell too low on people's waists. Later, the spokesman said Bush apologizes most sincerely to anyone he had offended. Some defended Bush, citing his age and health problems, while others pointed out that the allegations described a pattern of behavior that began years before he was in a wheelchair. The accusations complicated Bush's place in history, suggesting that even respected public figures with distinguished careers may have engaged in behavior that made women uncomfortable and violated their boundaries. Like many cases that emerged during the Me Too movement, Bush's story raised questions about accountability, intent, and how we reckon with the full complexity of public figures whose contributions exist alongside troubling personal conduct. Thanks for sticking with me this far. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Now, let's dive back in, because things are about to get a lot deeper. Tier 5. Bob Marley. Bob Marley's music continues to inspire millions with messages of peace, unity, and standing up against oppression. His reggae anthems like One Love and No Woman No Cry have become universal symbols of hope and healing. Rising from poverty in Jamaica to international stardom, Marley used his platform to promote Rastafarian spirituality and speak out against injustice. Even decades after his death from cancer at just 36, his image appears on posters and t-shirts worldwide, representing laid-back positivity and resistance to the system. But the man who sang about love and liberation had a much darker side in his personal relationships with women. Rita Marley, his wife, revealed in her autobiography that Bob was physically abusive, once beating her so severely she ended up in the hospital. Despite singing No Woman No Cry, Rita described living in fear of his violent outbursts. She stayed in the marriage, she said, because she believed in his music's message despite his personal contradictions. Marley fathered at least 11 children with 7 different women, and many of these relationships overlapped. While some might frame this as simply part of his Rastafarian beliefs, several of these women described controlling and manipulative behavior. He would often keep them isolated from each other and fly into jealous rages despite his own constant infidelity. Cindy Breakspear, who had a son with Marley while he was married to Rita, has spoken about his possessive nature and hostile treatment of women who didn't meet his expectations. According to people close to him, Marley would sometimes use both emotional manipulation and physical intimidation to maintain control over the women in his life. It's tough to wrap my head around how someone who spoke so beautifully about peace could act so differently in their personal life. The gap between Marley's public message and private behavior creates a painful contradiction for many fans. The men who wrote beautiful lyrics about emancipation and freeing ourselves from mental slavery struggled to treat the women in his life with basic respect and dignity. His impact includes both revolutionary music that has helped millions find their voice and a troubling pattern of domestic abuse that reminds us how someone can inspire the world while causing deep hurt to those closest to them. And speaking of people many look up to, this next figure is widely admired, but it's worth taking a closer look at the role corporations play in shaping that image. Bill Gates. Bill Gates has transformed from a tech billionaire into one of the world's most influential philanthropists. Through the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, he's directed billions towards fighting diseases like malaria and polio, improving education, and addressing climate change. After stepping back from Microsoft, Gates rebranded himself as a global problem solver, using his wealth and analytical mind to tackle humanity's biggest challenges. Many view him as a model of how the ultra-wealthy should give back to society. But Gates' reputation took a serious hit when his connections to Jeffrey Epstein came to light. Epstein was already a convicted sex offender in 2011 when Gates began meeting with him. According to reports by the New York Times and other outlets, Gates met with Epstein numerous times between 2011 and 2014, including visiting Epstein's Manhattan mansion at least 3 times and flying on Epstein's private jet. These meetings continued years after Epstein had been convicted of soliciting prostitution from a minor in 2008 and served 13 months in jail. What makes these meetings particularly troubling is that they had no clear professional purpose. Gates' representatives initially claimed the meetings were about philanthropy, but internal emails revealed Gates found Epstein's lifestyle intriguing. Former Gates Foundation employees reported being uncomfortable with the relationship and believed the Epstein connection contributed to Bill and Melinda's divorce in 2021. When questioned about the relationship in 2019 after Epstein's arrest on federal sex trafficking charges, Epstein died by suicide before trial. Gates first denied any business relationship or friendship with Epstein. Later, as more evidence emerged, Gates admitted the meetings but called them a huge mistake and said he hadn't realized the extent of Epstein's crimes. Gates' willingness to associate with a known sex offender raises uncomfortable questions about his judgment and values. Even as he worked to save lives globally, he chose to spend time with someone who had caused immense harm to vulnerable young women. The Epstein connection reminds us that philanthropy doesn't shield someone from ethical scrutiny, and that the powerful often receive second chances and social acceptance that wouldn't be extended to ordinary people with similar lapses in judgment. What do you guys think about the way people view Bill Gates? Is it fair to question someone with that much influence? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Isaac Newton. Isaac Newton stands among history's greatest scientists, the genius who discovered gravity, invented calculus, and revealed the laws of motion that explain how our physical world works. His Principia Mathematica revolutionized science, helping establish the scientific method and rational thinking that defines our modern world. Newton's work laid the foundation for enlightenment and centuries of scientific progress. In most textbooks, he appears as the ultimate rational thinker, using mathematics and careful observation to unlock nature's secrets. But there was another Newton that remained hidden for centuries after his death, a man obsessed with alchemy, biblical prophecies, and esoteric religious interpretations that many today would consider bizarre. Newton actually spent more time on these occult pursuits than on the mathematics and physics for which he's famous. When his private papers were finally examined in the 20th century, scholars were shocked to discover over 1 million words on alchemy and mystical interpretations of the Bible. Newton had a secret library where he conducted alchemical experiments, trying to discover the Philosopher's Stone that could turn base metals into gold and grant immortality. He wrote extensively about the vegetation of metals and believed matter contained secret spiritual forces. These weren't just casual interests. Newton deeply committed to these practices that modern science would dismiss as pseudoscience. While his work has earned widespread respect, these discoveries about his personal conduct add a more complicated dimension to his legacy. His religious views were equally unconventional and potentially dangerous at the time. Newton secretly rejected the Christian doctrine of the Trinity, which was considered heresy in 17th century England and could have cost him his position at Cambridge. He believed himself specifically chosen to decode biblical prophecies, calculating that the apocalypse would occur no earlier than 2060. Newton took great pains to hide these interests during his lifetime, aware they would damage his scientific reputation and potentially put him in danger. He wrote much of his alchemical work in code and kept his religious writings private. After his death, the Royal Society deemed these writings not fit to be printed and kept them hidden. Newton's secret obsessions revealed that even history's most celebrated rational mind contained contradictions. The same person who established the laws of physics also believed in mystical transmutation and spent countless hours searching for hidden messages in the Bible. His story reminds us that the line between science and pseudoscience wasn't always clear, and that brilliant minds often contain unexpected beliefs that don't fit neatly into our simplified versions of their lives. Before we continue, be sure to like and subscribe to show your support for my work, and then let's get into the deepest part of this iceberg. Tier 6. Nelson Mandela. Nelson Mandela is celebrated worldwide as a symbol of peaceful resistance, forgiveness, and racial reconciliation. After spending 27 years in prison for fighting against apartheid in South Africa, he emerged without bitterness to become the country's first black president and lead a remarkable transition to democracy. His decision to create the Truth and Reconciliation Commission rather than seek revenge against his former oppressors has made him a moral icon and Nobel Peace Prize winner. Schools, streets, and children around the world bear his name. But Mandela's early career as an activist was far more complicated than the sanitized version often presented. As a young leader in the African National Congress, ANC, Mandela became convinced that non-violent protest alone would never end apartheid. In 1961, he co-founded Umkhonto weSizwe, Spear of the Nation, the armed wing of the ANC, and became its first commander. Under his leadership, the group carried out a campaign of sabotage against government facilities, power plants, and infrastructure. While Mandela insisted they tried to avoid human casualties, focusing on empty buildings and infrastructure, people were sometimes injured in these operations. Mandela personally traveled abroad to receive military training and studied guerrilla warfare tactics. When arrested in 1962, he had just returned from Algeria, where he trained with freedom fighters. At his famous trial, Mandela didn't deny his role in planning sabotage, stating, "I do not deny that I planned sabotage. I did not plan it in a spirit of recklessness, nor because I have any love of violence. I planned it as a result of a calm and sober assessment of the political situation." During this period, Mandela also expressed admiration for communist revolutionaries like Fidel Castro and Che Guevara. He allied the ANC with the South African Communist Party and studied Marxist revolutionary theory. The United States kept Mandela on its terrorism watch list until 2008, long after he had become a respected global statesman. Mandela's journey from revolutionary to peacekeeper shows how people can evolve and grow. He never apologized for his early militancy, maintaining that armed resistance was necessary against a brutal regime that massacred peaceful protesters. Yet, the Mandela who emerged from prison had developed a more nuanced view, understanding that reconciliation, not vengeance, was the only path forward for his divided nation. His story reminds us that moral icons often begin as radicals pushing against an unjust status quo before history transforms them into symbols of peace. Shifting focus to another area, we come across another widely admired American figure whose legacy is more complex than it might first appear. Neil Armstrong. Neil Armstrong secured his place in history with those famous words, "One small step for man, one giant leap for mankind," as he became the first human to walk on the moon in July 1969. The Apollo 11 mission represented humanity's greatest adventure, and Armstrong, as its humble hero, embodied American ingenuity, courage, and achievement. After his return to Earth, Armstrong largely avoided the spotlight, working as a professor and serving on corporate boards while maintaining a reputation for quiet dignity. When he died in 2012, he was mourned as a national treasure. But behind Armstrong's carefully maintained public image, his family life was reportedly marked by serious problems that he chose not to address. According to allegations made by his granddaughter Collie Armstrong in recent years, Neil was aware of abusive behavior in his family but remained silent, prioritizing the family's reputation over protection of vulnerable members. Collie claimed that her father, Neil's son, Mark Armstrong, was physically and emotionally abusive to her and her mother. According to her account, when she and her mother sought help from Neil and his second wife, Carol, they were met with indifference. Collie has stated that Neil knew about the abuse but chose to maintain family appearances rather than intervening to protect his granddaughter. When Collie's mother tried to leave the abusive situation, Neil reportedly sided with his son and cut off financial support to his daughter-in-law. These allegations suggest that Armstrong's public persona as the straight-arrow engineer and American hero contrasted sharply with his handling of family crises. While he was celebrated for his cool-headed courage in space, he apparently lacked the courage to confront wrongdoing within his own family. Instead, he allegedly enabled the continuation of a destructive situation by lending his support and resources to the abuser rather than the victims. It's important to note that these remain allegations, and Armstrong is no longer alive to defend himself or explain his actions. His sons have disputed some of Collie's claims. However, the accusations point to a broader pattern among celebrated public figures whose admirable achievements in one sphere can coexist with moral failures in another. Armstrong's story, if the allegations are true, reminds us that even those we place literally among the stars may fall short in the most fundamental human responsibility, protecting the vulnerable people who depend on them. Next, we turn to a figure often credited with founding modern psychology, but as influential as his work was, his personal views raised difficult questions about the man behind science. Carl Jung. Carl Jung revolutionized our understanding of the human mind as one of the founding fathers of psychology. His concepts of the collective unconscious, archetypes, and psychological types have influenced everything from therapy and art to personality tests like the Myers-Briggs. Jung broke from his mentor, Freud, to explore spiritual dimensions of psychology, making room for the soul in a field that was becoming increasingly mechanistic. His work on dreams, symbols, and the integration of the shadow self continues to help people understand their deeper nature. But by the 1930s, as Nazi power rose in Germany, Jung's writings and actions revealed troubling sympathies with aspects of Nazi ideology, particularly around race. In papers and interviews from this period, Jung articulated theories about supposed differences between Jewish psychology and Aryan psychology. He suggested that these differences were innate and that certain psychological concepts were better suited to particular racial groups. In a 1934 paper, Jung wrote that the Jew who is something of a nomad has never yet created a cultural form of his own, a statement that echoed anti-Semitic Nazi propaganda. Jung served as president of the International General Medical Society for Psychotherapy from 1933 to 1940, during which time the German section was Nazified. While Jung helped many Jewish analysts escape Nazi Germany and maintained relationships with Jewish colleagues, he also allowed his organization to comply with Nazi racial policies in Germany. He initially seemed to view Hitler as a powerful manifestation of the German collective unconscious, describing him in terms that could be read as admiring the dictator's psychological power. After World War II and the full revelation of Nazi atrocities, Jung attempted to distance himself from his earlier statements. He claimed his writings had been misinterpreted and emphasized his efforts to help Jewish refugees. He also said he had been trying to work within the German system to preserve some independence for psychology rather than allowing it to be completely absorbed by Nazi ideology. Many Jungian scholars have struggled with this troubling period in Jung's career. Some attribute it to naivety about politics, while others see it as strategic compromise. Critics argue that Jung's racial theories weren't merely tactical, but reflected deeper biases in his thinking. His concept of collective racial psychology, which later abandoned, lent pseudo-scientific support to dangerous ideas about inherent differences between races. Jung's legacy, like his concept of the shadow, contains both light and darkness. The same thinker who helped millions understand their dreams and inner conflicts also, for a time, accommodated himself to a regime that would commit history's greatest atrocities. His story cautions us about the dangers of projecting racial characteristics onto psychological differences and shows us how even brilliant minds can be influenced by the prevailing prejudices of their time. The older I get, the more I see that no one's really the person they appear to be in the highlight reel. We're all a bit messy. Some people are just better at covering it up. If you enjoyed this video, please hit subscribe and be sure to watch our last video, The One Bad Thing About Every Country Iceberg.